Hello, I'm Nat McGrath. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a playwright, a dramaturg. Um, I am also somebody who works and runs projects in the culture and heritage sector, producing and commissioning artists, as well as working with academics and bringing communities and organisations together. So I have quite a varied um, portfolio. Um, and one of the reasons I'm talking to you today is I was the contributing writer and dramaturg on Small Town Boys, which is Shaper Caper's show that they're touring across Scotland this year. And that was an amazing experience to be part of in 2023 when we first made the show. And I'm super excited to see it again this summer. So there are, as a playwright, I want to kind of talk to you about a really positive experience working in an archive, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit how archives have featured in all of my work as a writer and as somebody who runs arts and heritage projects as well. So I'm also I'm a co-director of an organisation called Dreadnought Southwest. So I work and live in Devon, but I also work in Scotland. And with Dreadnought, we're the guardians of a collection of oral stories of women and non-binary people's activism. And we tour this archive across the region, and it goes into residence. So it's an archive that's taken to people rather than being a collection that's just held in one place. And that helps us develop the scale and the reach of the stories across the region, which is from Cornwall to Wiltshire, the stories. So it's quite a huge geographical kind of reach that it has. And I co-run Dreadnought Southwest with Josie Sutcliffe. And I've also been part of developing another collection of LGBTQIA plus stories, oral stories for a project called Out and About Queering the Museum at RAM. RAM is the Royal Albert Memorial Museum. It's Exeter's flagship cultural venue. And this is a permanent installation in the museum. So in order to bring queer and trans voices into the museum space. So each interview that was undertaken, a person responded to an object in the collections to try and open up the lens or the interpretation of the object and to create this unique collection that the museum now has, and it's permanent and on display permanently. So there's something for me in the power of stories and the power of, in particular, oral story collection. And just to say that my interest really developed as I encountered, so I think encounter is a really nice word, the Plymouth LGBT archive run by Dr. Alan Butler. And when I first experienced that archive in person, if you like, rather in a digital capacity, because you can listen to some of the stories online as well, as you can with the Rebellious Sounds archive, which is Dreadnought's archive, and the Queering the Museum collection. And the Plymouth LGBT archive was in a school in Plymouth. And so it had a very different community around it, and it was accessible for people to ask questions about it in their immediate environment. And it just made me think about how an archive, and particularly with a collection of recorded stories of lived experiences, is that it creates a community. And I really love that idea and that notion. And it's been a thread through, I think, my work over the past sort of 5 years, really, in terms as a writer as well. And uh, I wrote a piece that was called We'll Meet in Moscow, that was a Traverse Theatre production. It was an audio drama for the summer programme, when there was still a mix of online and just coming back to in-person events at the festival. And that was influenced by and inspired by love letters that were put in a collection um, and smuggled out of Russia to be published in America. And there were love letters between LGBTQ plus Russians, and that was, it felt like, though, that archiving of letters I think are really significant in terms of LGBTQIA plus history, and how we have been able to unearth stories, in particular love stories, and also this idea that language as coded, that's something I'm really interested in as well. But I also, the last play I had produced was called The Beat of Our Hearts. Just so you can, that's published by Salamander Street, who are great indie press, and that play was developed as part of an EDI fellowship with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and with a lead academic at Exeter University, Dr. Charlotte Jones. And it was looking at new histories of LGBTQIA plus loneliness and belonging. And I was commissioned to write a play exploring that, and we worked with lots of LGBTQIA plus people in the community, and from across the Southwest. We had 2 groups, and we did all that work online, which at the time I wasn't quite sure how that would work. But one of the things that, the questions that kept coming up, was how are our stories and our histories recognised in the past? Who knew we were there? Because we know we were there. And one of the things that we did was we asked people to bring in objects that were of significant value to their own queer or trans story. And it was really influential in terms of the play, which starts with, and I'm very aware that we're seeing incidences like this occur and hearing about them in the media, but the story starts with a pride flag being burned in a local small coastal community in the Southwest. And then it's how that LGBTQ plus community fractures and then comes back together. And what really brings them back together is the idea, they find a photograph, and that photograph starts to kind of set in motion the story of a new uncovered heritage, or a history of queer and trans ancestors in that place. And so they decide to create an archive, and that archive becomes a healing space and brings them together. And so it's something that's had been on my mind for a while, of how the archives can be these places. And obviously, to counter that, we also know that with big institutions, sometimes archival collections can be inaccessible. They can be catalogued in a very particular way, that they are not speaking to us. So I'm particularly talking about the community archives, the archives that are being created now, or the archives that have been kept and built and housed in people's homes, and collections that then may get donated. So there's something important about how we have ownership over the telling of the story of an archive, or where an archive comes from, or who controls the narrative of it. So that's just to say. So really, the kind of the focus here is that I have been developing a new play called Cusp, and this was one of the reasons I was invited to do this. And that Cusp, I was able to have a residency at Glasgow Women's Library. It's a couple of years ago now, and that can happen with plays. In case there's any playwrights out there or new people to playwriting, that they can take time, and that it's okay if they do. Just so you know, and I was, thanks to funding and support from Playwright Studio Scotland, through the Self-Led Fund, and support from Emma and Louise, who have been brilliant at guiding that process, and were incredibly supportive of the work itself. So thank you to them. And the team at Glasgow Women's Library, which houses what was called LAIC, L-A-I-C, but which is now the Lesbian Archive collection. And that collection has I have a story and connection to it myself. So because I first encountered it over 25 years ago, when I was an undergraduate writing my dissertation, and the archive, I visited it as it was being packed up and away to come to Glasgow. And there had been cuts to their funding, and they couldn't afford the rent anymore. And so it needed to find a new home. So that's, again, there's something about home and community and archives, and where they belong and what's in it, who they belong to. So there are all those kind of up in the air kind of questions around archives that I have all the time. And so I was able to come into the space where it had been in London, and I was young, and I didn't quite, I don't think, comprehend the enormity and the value of the collection at the time. But I do now. And there's nothing quite like it. And it was always an aspiration of mine to be able to spend time with that archive. And actually, it's much bigger than I thought. So I was able to have a residency at Glasgow Women's Library, and it was so I had to get very selective very quickly about what I wanted to look for. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Cusp, but also because I'm going to go back and forth. I tend to do that with my writing anyway, and the process that kind of unfolds. But when I first visited the archive in London, there was I met Jackie Forster, who is an absolute kind of queer icon and legend. But I didn't know it at the time when I met her. It was only years later that I realised who I had spent the day with. So I was very thankful that I did take a bottle of wine, and that was very gratefully received for a meeting that happened later on in the day. But you just have to remember that when I first visited that archive, we didn't have access to the internet in the way that we do now. There wasn't a digital kind of awareness of that collection or its presence. So I was, and this is probably for my own archive collection, so there are questions about what we keep in order to tell our stories. So original kind of newsletters from the archive. And these in particular talk about it moving to Glasgow and the reasons why, and an original invitation to Glasgow Women's Library. And this is September 1995. So this letter is from May, and this is sort of June, actually, and this is from September. So within that space of time, that collection had moved in 3 or 4 months. You can tell I'm a writer, can't you? Just getting interested in those things. So, and I've always wondered why I kept this ephemera, if you like, and I knew that there was a story in there waiting to kind of be explored, to be told, that had a connection to Scotland, and that my desire to tell a story was able to grow because of the funding. So Cusp is a love story that spans decades and begins in whisky country in Speyside as 2 young women fall in love in the 1960s. And then they move apart, live different lives, and then meet again as much older people. And the play is influenced by the whisky making process. So the other thing I was able to do as part of that residency, so if you don't know about Playwright Studio Scotland and you're a playwright, listen to this. It's just a fantastic, fantastic resource. So do find out about them. And so I was able to go to the Balvenie distillery and to kind of understand that very unique particular process that they have there, because they have their own maltings floor. Not all distilleries have their own maltings floors anymore, and they have their own field of barley. It's very small, but they still use their own barley as well as other barley for the process. So there's just something about that had captured my imagination. But the other thing that I wanted to explore were legislative changes across Scotland in terms of LGBTQ plus rights. And so, because I felt that that would help chart that passage of time and how love can survive across time. And so there's also something about rights and activism, which is another strand of things that are, I think, very relevant to our community and work that is done, whether it's arts activism or activism in all its many, many shapes and sizes. And also just knowing that the founders of Glasgow Women's Library, Adele and Sue, were activists in their own right and change makers in Scotland, as particularly during Section 28, and how that collection kind of started to sort of, it takes on so many different narratives and so many different strands and moves and weaves. And so there's something about language, and obviously I have a writer. So, and there's something about this process of whisky making. There's something about this process of unpacking materials in an archive, discovering them, and how, as part of that process, there's a kind of a collect language. And in that collection of language and phrases and things that just sing to my heart, I start to build the world of something. So that word infused, which is very, very relevant to the whisky making process, is kind of very much part of my process as a writer. So, and what was interesting, this is just an aside story, as I was travelling north as far as I could go on the train, because you cannot get a train all the way to Duffton, which is where the Balvenie distillery is. There was 2 young people on the train, and they obviously hadn't they'd been out all night, they'd been clubbing for the first time, and I was just kind of, they were sat very close to me, so I could hear some of the things they were saying, and they'd obviously been to a queer club for the first time, and they were so full of energy and excitement and care for one another that it was just a really touching human moment that really fueled my sense of adventure and my spirit as I travelled on and was thinking about writing this play. So it starts in 1968, which is a year of revolution. I felt like it just that year, that launch pad, that as the world is changing and around the characters and coming from a particular landscape. So as I started to unfold the contents of archival boxes at Glasgow Women's Library, and I started to what started to unfold was the depth of the lives that had been lived, lives saved, the lives that reached out in adversity through loneliness and shame against the tide, against patriarchal structures, religious structures. And such courage started to emerge just in the 4 or 5 boxes that I had chosen to look at. Particularly, one of the things that I wanted to look at, and will come, this is a kind of a thread that I talked about earlier with Will Mead in Moscow, was the collection of a magazine called Sappho. And in Sappho, there are these very short personal letters that are printed in those pages, and they are so they're so moving and tell us snapshots of people's lives at a time that where there wasn't the same visibility that we have now. And there are poems anonymously submitted. There are vivid photographs in the collection, particularly in the Glasgow chapter of the Lesbian Avengers, which got me incredibly excited. And Claire Duffy, who was working with me on the project, that these photographs had made it into the Glasgow Herald and were telling the story of the protests around Section 28 in the 1980s and around the AIDS crisis as well. So the protests in support of healthcare, for healthcare. So as the kind of the days unfolded, as those rituals of opening each morning the box and taking these precious items that have been carefully kind of folded away to preserve them and kept, began to make its mark and an imprint on me and the lives and the trials and tribulations from the letters and the stories from the 60s and 70s. And I grew up under Section 28, so there were lots of connecting threads and stories around that time that I had experienced. But looking even further back, just I found heartrending and moving. And I think that knowing that these small newsletters that were produced and sent out to people, put in the post, just that were lifelines, and how many of those personal letters said from women, particularly still in domestic situations and heterosexual marriages but receiving that newsletter was an absolute kind of awakening and a lifeline, or knowing it was there, knowing that there were other things. And so what I really discovered at the heart of all the materials and what I listened into was this sense of a spirit, a formidable spirit of determination against discrimination, a determination to connect, find community, find self-expression, and for some, to be visible, to fight injustice, to challenge the law, to fight erasure and prejudice. And what felt like, at times, reading the language, thinking about that kind of legislation and the law, a pathologizing of lesbians, a demonization of them in the kind of the public eye and in some of the journalism and some of the news accounts, and in some instances criminalization with some of the publications that are kept that go even further back to the 20s and 30s. And, obviously a sense of deja vu of we've been here before in terms of language has been creeping up on me reading this, and where we are now with the terrible kind of vitriol that is being perpetuated in the media at the moment, and may it stop soon. So, but amidst that adversity, there's also celebration, and there's a lot of dancing, a lot of particularly Duffy's disco, and there's heartache and heartbreak, ecstasy and anguish, and in the words of Sappho. And so amongst the collection, and that, remember, I was there for just kind of 4 days really. There are books, photographs, personal papers and journals, ephemera that includes badges and T-shirts. The Camden Lesbian Centre and Black Lesbian Group Archive is also there. There are banners and placards. There are the personal papers of Jackie Forster. So I felt like there was another kind of full circle of points in time, which again, I think now I'm just thinking about it, is significant in trying to tell a story that spans a long period of time, which is something, stretching time as a playwright, something I'm really interested in, and how that can happen, or just as a writer. So archives tell many stories, and I found working at Glasgow Women's Library a very welcoming, safe and inclusive space. That has to be said, because it's important to our community. And so there is something about, you make a relationship with an archive, a particular kind of collection like this, that speaks to us. But there's also about that thing about making relationships with the archivists, with the guardians of collections, and thinking about how we might contribute to archival collections, or even create our own, or how our artistic work becomes part of a wider and a broader archive of LGBTQIA plus work telling our stories. So it's, not just objects and ephemera, but that are important. But there's also something I recently, back in February, I was able to go to a conference at the V&A in Dundee called Hands Off, LGBTQ plus cultural heritage and ethical stewardship of queer and trans archives. And I learned so much from those couple of days I was there. It's led by Professor Glyn Davis from the University of St Andrews. And if you're interested in archives, I think it could be worth looking this, you can join their mailing list and find out how it's not just scholarship, but a lot of the people talking at the conference were talking about how they developed archives that are in their homes. Where does the guardianship go? One of the most kind of inspiring moments of those couple of days were hearing E.J. Scott from the Museum of Transology talk. He's just fantastic. And he talked so passionately about how language is so important and how we tell our stories. And so the labeling of objects in that museum is equally as important as the object itself. And that just really got me thinking, and it felt like, again, this notion of an archive or a museum of objects that is created by a community, and it speaks to its community. And there's something so crucial and vital also in that work, and how language, we're back to language, how language is used. So in the future, our stories are cared for and held in the language that we would use, and that actually how then art and writing and culture has such an important role to play in the translation of how we honour and celebrate and challenge and take stock of the world around us and say something new, because our stories matter.